Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TEFAF Coffee Talks. I'm so happy to have you here and know that you've had some obstacles getting here because of this rainstorm out there and traffic. And it's Sunday morning, after all, so I really appreciate you being here. My name is Linda Lees. I'm the director of the cultural program at TEFAF New York. I'm particularly happy to have this panel because it builds on a conversation that we had in fall of 2017, in spring of 2017. The coffee talk started in fall of 2016, so we've managed to keep this thing going and ever more rich and interesting conversations, including having the TEFAF coffee talk. So I urge you to look at the brochure and see if there's something else you'd be interested in attending while you're here. A couple of pieces of housekeeping. Please turn off your cell phones. Even the best of us forget sometimes to do that. The second thing is this is live streamed, and it will be on Facebook. It's live streamed on Facebook now, and will be up for a couple of weeks on Facebook. And then once it's finally edited, it will be on the website forever. As are all the panels that we've ever done. So you can use them as an educational resource. You can go back and look at this spring 2017 conversation about the art market, which I assure you was a very, very lively conversation that morning. And use it for whatever purpose you'd like. So I turn it over now to our I'm very delighted to have Natasha do this because I believe she's the perfect person. She's professor and chair of the Art Market Studies at the Fashion Institute of Technology, which may not seem related to the Latin American art market, but you're soon going to find out why. Thank you, Natasha.
Sure. Well, first off, thank you all for coming out on this rainy, dismal Sunday. As Linda said, my name is Natasha Deegan, and I'm delighted to be moderating this panel, especially with such an illustrious group. Just to kick off, some introductions. First, we're joined by, on the far end, Margaret Carrigan, who is the art market editor at the Art newspaper, where she covers key issues and events affecting the commercial art world in the US and across the Americas in general. Her art writing and criticism at large focuses on the work of women and minorities in the art world and has appeared in The Observer, ArtNet News, Artsy, and Frieze, among others. And then next is Leon Tovar, who is a New York-based gallerist specializing in Latin American modernism. His first location opened in Bogota, Colombia in 1990 with a presentation of work by Sala Witt and Bernard Venet. In 2002, he moved his operation to New York, and particularly to the Upper East Side, where we are now, of course, where he was among the first galleries to promote and exhibit geometric, kinetic, optical and constructivist tendencies practiced by Latin America's vanguard artists to an international audience. After 25 years of programming, he opened his second location in New York's Nomad neighborhood in 2015, and the gallery now operates with 2 locations on the Upper East Side, its newest space opening in conjunction with this fair, so that's very exciting. And then finally, to my immediate left is Pablo Leon de la Barra, who is curator at large Latin America at the Guggenheim Museum and curator at the Museo de Arte Contemporánea de Niterói, located across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. And I'm going to quote from Art Review's Power 100 list and say that he has become a gatekeeper to success for young Latin American artists and the person to tap up if you need local expertise. Art Basel brought him on board for its inaugural Cities program in Buenos Aires. He was a nominator for the Frieze Artists Award, juror for the Nasher Prize, section curator at Expo Chicago, and sat on the selection committee for Peru's 2019 Venice Pavilion. And those of you who are based in New York may recall his exhibition, Under the Same Sun, Art from Latin America, which opened at the Guggenheim Museum in 2014. So I'm delighted to be joined by our 3 panelists.
Thank you. Thanks.
So to start off, I wanted to actually quote from you, Pablo, and particularly from the catalog from Under the Same Sun, where Pablo wrote that the term Latin America was, and I quote here, first applied in the 1830s by the French thinker Michel Chevalier to differentiate Latin from Anglo-Americas, and later by Napoleon III to oppose British and US interests in the region. And so if we were to follow this logic, perhaps Haiti or Quebec would be considered maybe Latin American, or even the United States, especially with its growing Latino or Latinx population. So that leads me maybe to our introductory question, which is, what do we mean when we reference Latin American art by the term Latin American art? Maybe we'll start with you, Pablo, just because I was drawing on your catalog essay.
I think it's a term that we continue rethinking as we continue working, That what Latin America meant in the 70s in terms of art and artists and art production, today has a total different meaning and many multiple different other points of view.
So what, between the 1970s and today, what would you say is the main differentiation?
I would think that in the 70s we were more ghettoized, and I think a lot of things multiple things having happening in Latin America itself, but also in the States, that have changed this perception. On one hand, artists not wanting to be labeled Latin American, wanting to say, oh, I'm an artist, and this has kind of challenged us into think how we call what we're doing. Gerardo Mosquera, Cuban critic, already maybe 15, 20 years ago, suggested we should say it's not Latin American art, but art from Latin America, art produced in Latin America. Today, I would even suggest, that we should reclaim the name of the continent, that we should call it art Americano, American art, that we should call art from the United States, United Stadian art, And that we should challenge these labels. I'll go back to it later, because on the other hand, I'll also say that these labels are very useful, And for example, for us at the museum at the Guggenheim, it's a way of challenging imbalances that existed before, So bringing artists from Latin America into the collection, giving them the space, showing them. So in a way, it's a double-handed thing, We don't want to be called Latin American, but on the other hand, it's useful in ways to gain more visibility. And again, there's the problem of Latin art that you mentioned, and I think we should also talk a little bit about it, Latinx, as they call it now, and how do we deal with the ever-growing Latin population in the States?
Just to piggyback on what you were saying about that, I think that what's interesting about the question that you ask of what are we talking about when we talk about Latin American art, the fact that we have to ask that question is really telling, because I think that the way that we're just like making simple, tiny shifts to the language around it, like saying artists of Latin America instead, is really important, because I think it took on a historical kind of shape, the term Latin American art, for a long time, and kind of became its own category, but when it's not, it's a geographic distinction. And so trying to parse that and where that, as not to use the hackneyed term, we live in a globalized world, but we do. And I think that grappling with language per se is really important right now, even just flesh out in real time in a setting like this, where you have people that are well-versed in the history and the region, and what that means and what that looks like in different contexts.
Well, I think in the mid-70s, I agree with Pablo. I think it was Sotheby's, they started to make a Latin American department. And the beginning was great for Latin American just to show what they have. But at the end, after many years, the auction houses, they start to divide the art world also, because I'm talking about that's the economic part of this business. In the beginning was good for us, or for Latin America, but at the end, we noticed that this division of the departments has been go back to the beginning and put us in a position, like a ghetto position, in terms of the economic results. And now, as you see, auction houses like Sotheby's or Phillips, they are changing the whole spectrum of the departments. For example, Reverón or Santa Maria is going to the Impressionist department. Frida Kahlo, Carrington, Lam Mata is going to the Surrealist department. Obviously, the world is divided by countries, continents, religions, languages, but when we're talking about art, we are just a single planet. And I think that things are changing today, that's what I think.
So what are the, in terms of the impetus for this change, what would you identify? Is it where collectors are coming from? Is it a new sense of a more globalized discourse around modern and contemporary art? What are the reasons for Latin American art maybe breaking through the sort of silo of the Latin American art category?
Well, I think Latin American art, you cannot define that, they have the sophistication to be collectible. In the mid-50s, 40s, even, well, don't talk about the beginning of the century with artists as Torres Garcia, they create a group, or they were followers from the early 30s of Torres, and they create this Madi group. Then after that, you see how Fontana, they take some ideas from the Madi group and they develop his career. And then he was successful. It was a great artist that everybody take care about, or they think that was a European artist. And they mutate everything to Europe. But at the end, I think what we're doing on this type of afters or events, even museums, is to put the whole context of Latin America at the same level or the level that they deserve in comparison with another important art.
Yeah, so you raise museums, and actually this is something I want to ask you, Pablo, which is, it seems like especially maybe in the last 10 years or so that there's been a spate of exhibitions and acquisitions, even acquisition funds. So the sort of institutional trajectory seems to be going in a particular direction. How would you describe what's happened in the last 10 years, and why do you think this is happening, that institutions are now much more interested in this region?
Yeah, so I'll talk from my experience at the Guggenheim. I started working there 6 years ago, hired as Latin American curator to do the UBS MAP project. And basically it was about bringing contemporary artists from Latin America into the collection and doing an exhibition of the works that came into the collection. So we brought about 30 artists, about 40-something works. The exhibition went also to Mexico City, to Museo Jumex, and to London, to South London Gallery. So it started to create an impetus. And I think it was important that the museum recognized that it was not only about showing art here, but also how can we expand this work that we're doing and exhibit it somewhere else. So that's why it was important that the exhibition happened also in Mexico, in Latin America, that it went to London also to kind of expand and create this kind of sharing the knowledge. Now that I've been there for 6 years, we were doing numbers the other day, and it's really impressive that in 6 years, and since the UBS program finished, we started the Latin American Circle, which is a group of patrons, most of them from Latin America, but some are not. Some are US collectors, French collectors, who are supporting us in this mission of continuing our relationship to bringing and showing art from Latin America in the Guggenheim. So in 6 years, we've brought as many artists from Latin America to the collection as there had been brought before in 54 years. The museum is now 60 years. So it's really incredible that we've managed to do this and to kind of, as I was saying, to kind of change the absence, and try to change the imbalance. Now, still within, doing this amazing job, within Latin America itself, you have lots of imbalances. So something we've been looking a lot is gender issues, ethnic issues, So of this 60-something artists that we've brought in the last 6 years, the balance is almost 50-50 men and women, Before it was like 80-20. We've been looking at issues of artists of color from Latin America, So we brought in the first black female artist, Sonia Gomez, into the collection, Carlos Martiel, a Cuban performance artist. So, so really looking also at these topics because again, when you say Latin America, it's multiple Latin Americas, you know. Issues of, again, we don't want to be nation specific, but issues of where the artists are working, you know. Normally when people talked about Latin America, it was about the 7, 8 big countries which have more presence. Mexico, Cuba, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and there's a whole other countries in the region which are totally like overlooked, no? Central America, the countries in the Caribbean, Ecuador, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay. So we've really made that effort also to look beyond what was normally understood and considered Latin America. And again, you find all these different, from avant-garde moments, moments of abstraction, contemporary moments, which have in many cases been totally overlooked. And when you find, I mean, that there was this incredible different moments where artists were producing, I mean, not only connected to other avant-gardes happening in the States or Europe, but even producing different thinking that kind of challenges a canon. No? So I think that's part of why it's still sometimes useful to use the term, you know, because we can use it to challenge the canon, to bring artists, to bring works. Of course, our desire would be, I mean, one day that we don't have to think about these things, that things, that artworks are shown next to each other, that we have continuously exhibitions of artists from the region in the museum without having to make an issue out of it.
Sure, sure. It's interesting that you raised sort of expanding the category too, because this is a question I want to ask you about, you know, this issue between Latin American, whether or not that should include Latinx artists. So I know this is something you wrote about recently in reference to the section at Frieze. For those of you who haven't been, there's a section, a dedicated section at Frieze that is curated by 2 curators from El Museo de Barrio, which includes both Latin American artists from you know, from South America and from the Latin American countries, as well as artists from the US. So I wanted to ask you what you think about whether or not these artists should be, you know, considered part of a wider definition of Latin American art.
I think that this starts to raise like kind of some of the friction points between the term Latin American in general right now. Because in my discussions with a lot of the gallerists that were participating in this new section at Frieze, which was just introduced for the first time this year, which is that they need the exposure for contemporary artists, right? Like there is an established canon of what we call Latin American art that people kind of, you know, understand to be Frida Kahlo and you know, beyond that, like, you know, Ligia Papi and like a whole host of historical figures that reside in there that have gained so much both commercial and institutional visibility. But then what happens when you kind of flatten out the contemporary landscape with this term? And that's kind of where we started seeing issues with the limitations of the term, where there's so many artists that are working today in, you know, Latin American countries that don't necessarily fit within that category. Like you were saying, there's just like, it doesn't all line up with like what we understand to be historical movements or even things that are happening now. Like they're developing their own, you know, visual aesthetic and rhetoric and whatnot, and in response to the things that are going on, not just within their countries, but on a global scale. And so I think what I found really interesting in my conversations with so many of those, with the gallerists that were involved in this Dialogo section, was that they were really grateful for the exposure that this could offer artists that were, you know, 40 and under, essentially. That's a lot of the ages that they were working with. But then at the same time, people didn't always understand what the conversation was about. Should it be regional? Should it be, you know, national? Should it be global? And they felt like maybe they were kind of being funneled into a certain cookie cutter of what this looks like, and they were trying to fight against that while also trying to maintain visibility here. And just as kind of something that I cited in the piece that I wrote on this was that ultimately, as useful as this visibility and this terminology and these labels can be to actually like helping us understand what we're looking at and getting us toward a more diverse marketplace in contemporary art, at the same time, it's not allowing, like the overall number of exhibitors from South America and Central America and Frieze this year was only about 7%, still, even with this added section.
Right.
So it's still very low, and it's something that we need to be very mindful of going forward is how is this term helping them and limiting them? Because I don't think that they're, saying we don't want to use this Latin American term anymore, but we also really want to make sure that we're expanding the reach of it, which is where some of the conversation around Latinx comes in. And I think a lot of people also get confused about how Latinx is functioning as a term, because that also has to do with like the Latin American diaspora of like what it means to be an American with some sort of Latin American ancestry and things like that. And then also the kind of the post-colonial connotations of Latin American art too, or being a Latin American artist, I think is problematic for a lot of these younger contemporary artists working today, and they're trying to shake that off. But the term Latinx might also be falling prey to some of the same issues with the Latin American label, which is that it flattens out the field too much.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting because I think what you were saying too, where Latin American art maybe started as a market term, this is something that we see in a lot of different, in terms of regional work, whether it's modern Indian art, which also started as a market category and then kind of developed an art historical sort of discourse around it after that. And it can be very useful for people to sort of understand or in terms of familiarity or recognizability of a particular region's artist, but then also clearly there are limitations as well. But something that I think you raised, Pablo, as well as you, Leon, about showing the work of Latin American artists in the two contexts, right? And for an international audience, like Under the Same Sun, showing it at the Guggenheim as well as at the UMEX, and kind of one thing I wanted to ask you about is the reception of this work in these two contexts, in the sort of more international context, whether that be here in New York or London, where there have been many exhibitions, but also art fairs that have showed dedicated presentations of Latin American art, versus within Latin America itself. And obviously, Leon, you're also a great person to ask, having participated in numerous international art fairs, having your start in Bogota, but also showing this work here in New York. How do you negotiate those two audiences?
Well, in our case, it's a learning process from us too, and also from the collectors. After probably the last 20 years, the museums are doing a great job to include in their programs strongly the Latin American artists. But in our case, I think we start probably more than 25 years ago. And we see how the market changed, the collectors change, but also we discover that very high-end collectors, they start to buy art in the 50s, like the Rockefeller collection. Mm-hmm. And we discovered also magnificent, fantastic works in European collections, but still the label is something that at the end of the movie, it doesn't make sense when you go back and you see the artists like Negret, and there was part of the group of Agnes Martin, John German, Kelly, Louis Nevelson. And I think that's what we need to promote today to the new collectors, to the old collectors, that has been done before already. Mm-hmm. We need to renegotiate everything. But I think the approach with the people was really positive, and we're getting in a very important collection that has been never bought Latin American artists, and we are very pleased, actually, and everything is changing very positively, very in the good way, actually.
One thing I thought was very interesting in your booth here at TEFAF is the inclusion of the Alexander Calder piece within the context of Latin American art. Is that something deliberate that you want,
Yeah, definitely. Calder, Venezuela was very important for Calder, as even Pizarro, landscapes from Central America, and if you go back also to Gauguin, it's a question of make the real connection. That they are not conversations, because the people, they think they are conversations, but no, they are real connections. And Calder is is one of the most important kinetic artists that they exist, but nobody treated him as a kinetic.
Right.
And it's a misinterpretations of many things, and Calder was very important. That's why it's there, actually.
And I wanted to ask you about whether the show, say Under the Same Sun, whether it was the same show in New York as it was in Mexico City, or did you kind of change the show to account for the different audiences?
It was the same group of works with minor variations that kind of related in a different way in each place. I was thinking, following Leon's thought about, one about the importance of the galleries in doing this work. No, I was very amazed now that I was walking early through the fair to see at least 3 incredible booths showcasing incredible works by artists from Latin America. Leon Tovar, the Barbara Gladstone with the Brazilian artist, and Lina Bobardi, and Bergamina Gomide from Sao Paulo. And what you see is that you see works that not only are of incredible high quality, but which in their own moment were kind of challenging what being avant-garde meant, no? And for me, it's always been a lesson, for example, going to Leon's gallery or to his booth when I go to the Bogota Art Fair. And it's learning history. And I think that the role that galleries do in this way of bringing works that that maybe we didn't know about them, because not all the works are in museums. Latin American museums have very weak structures. So sometimes many of these works are located in private collections.
Yeah.
They come back and are made visible to us again through the market, no?
Yeah,
so,
definitely. Yeah, the position of the galleries are really important in the whole movie, and we make really very deep investigations. Even books that has been published in the States, we correct the dates because there are a lot of misinformation too. And it's a learning process even for us. Obviously, the people, curators from the MoMA, Tate, Metropolitan, every single museum, they go to see important works. In our case, we deal with the Metropolitan Museum, with Tate, Reina Sofia, Guggenheim, George Pompidou. The people go and see, and also they learn. And we learn too, also. And
I think it's important that you mentioned the Calder, for example, in terms, thinking Calder next to Otero, no? Thinking Elio Oiticica next to Joseph Albers, thinking Gego next to Agnes Martin. So there's a lot of dialogues that we still need to be made more visible to others. No? Maybe us as collectors and curators, we kind of make those connections, but I think it's important in this kind of rethinking and rechallenging how many histories have been read and presented to create these new dialogues, these new collection presentations, these new ways of understanding the complexity of modernity in the whole globe, but also what's happening now. No? So I think, galleries, collectors. I see 2 of my members here from the Latin American circle. So it's really an important. Their support is really important for us. In loving inside the museum for this change to happen. So it's not only about bringing funds that allow us to purchase works, but also kind of doing this kind of pushing for change to happen inside the institution.
Well, I think it's just to kind of piggyback on what you both have said, and I'm thinking again of like the more emerging galleries that I've been speaking with recently, is that I think, what the kind of work you've done over the past several decades, Leon, and bringing it to these histories to greater visibility in the marketplace, and then likewise, Pablo, with you doing it on the institutional level, I feel like we're getting to a place, and this is why we're able to question the term now, is that there is more understanding, and there's more, I think you guys have done a wonderful job of essentially educating the public on these very important artists, and then how do we move that forward? How do we move the needle forward going on from this? Now that we have more institutional recognition and we have more marketplace visibility for these artists, with the next generation, how do we keep that going, and what does that look like?
That is somewhat related to another question that I had for you, which is that this season in particular, it seems like we're seeing many more Latin American works included in post-war and contemporary sales. So, in a way, in dialogue with artists who are not from Latin America, even if it is in a commercial context rather than a curatorial or institutional context. So what do you think, what are the reasons for this? And is this something that ultimately will help Latin American art as a
I
category?
think it was a really smart move from let's say, Sotheby's and Phillips. They integrate Latin American artists or artists that has been born in Latin America. Probably some of them, they live in Europe or in America for many years. And they integrate. It's nothing that we disappear. We just place it in the right movement. And as I mentioned before, if you're a collector of surrealists, you need to have a Lam and Roberto Mata, You cannot have just Magritte and their group, because they were part of the group, If you have a Picasso, you need to have a Lam, if you are a really knowledgeable collector. And I think it's really important that the auction houses start to understand that we are not just a name there, We are part of the art world.
I think what's really interesting to kind of go back a little bit in this same conversation is that, as we mentioned, the term Latin American art was really introduced with Sotheby's back in
76.
Yeah, and now they were one of the first auction houses to dissolve their dedicated Latin American sales. So I think if we're looking at the kind of secondary market as responsive to some of these trends, like both Sotheby's and Phillips have integrated Latin American art into their modern and contemporary sales, and they've seen much better results for those artists. They're fetching higher and higher prices. Like that's very telling that there's context and knowledge going with collectors that are like, oh yes, like it's actually much more valuable for these artists to have their work, alongside other major people that have already been involved in the canon for a long time and have these established market values, because otherwise we're just kind of like relegating them to their own side conversation, and they're not going to realize the price that their work actually is worth in the context of history.
Yeah, I asked for the results actually. Now, before, when it was just the Latin American department, was I think 2,500 catalogs. And now there are 6,000 catalogs, including Latin America. The BIs decreased from 40% to 20%. BIs means that pieces that has been not sold in the auction. They increased 153% the value of the low estimate. Means that obviously, in the beginning everybody was like, oh my God, they disappear Latin America in the Latin American departments, but obviously not. We are getting the right position.
Which I must say that it's great, but then for us at museums, this means the prices are higher. we need to move faster. You see Elijah Clark out there. It's great that she's there. But even if I pass the basket here to get $2 million to buy it, I think, hopefully we'll get it together in this room. But
No, but also for institutions, obviously they will be difficult. But if you see the big picture in terms of prices, sometimes I have a neighbor galleries, they represent artists like Christopher Wall, that was $400,000 8 years ago, and now it's $40 million. We're still very affordable.
Relatively affordable.
No, I would say, and because I'm saying this, is that that it's important also that, yes, it's great that we have a Latin American circle supporting us, but it's great that museum groups and museum directions see it also as part of the responsibility to incorporate Latin American into the whole picture, that it's part of the job that we do in the Latin American circle, but it's important that, let's say, U.S. collectors and the rest of the other groups support this happening, so it should be a joint effort. Same with Latinx, Latinx are part of U.S. American. Museum collections should incorporate them also and support them as American artists. And I think it same happens, and that's another topic that hasn't even yet been touched, not here, but in the mainstream discussions. Native American artists, genetically they're the same as many indigenous Latin American artists. So how do you deal with this, and how do we support again visibility, challenging labels, and getting their work seen, shown, and part of the collections?
Mm-hmm.
So I think actually now might be a good time to open it up to questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions, I think we have a question right in the front here. So 1 second to get a mic.
Good morning. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'm a huge fan of all of your work, and being from California and having lived many years in Miami, I have maybe a higher index for appreciation for artists from different places outside of Europe and North America, regardless of the title. My question is this. Also, coming from Los Angeles, there was a massive initiative that I was surprised that so few people really outside of California, as were they, were aware that the Getty put together, it was 70 initiatives together in 4 months called LALA by Pacific Standard Time, and the work of people like Ella Cisneros and Rosa de la Cruz and even Jorge Perez. I think patrons like these and initiatives like these have such an important place, and I'm wondering what you're seeing in your respective areas in terms of the growth of the patronage.
You're the museum.
No, want to say that the Getty initiative was incredible, no? So having that amount of funds to support institutions, to show Latin and Latinx artists, and to do research. I think that research there is the clue work, no? That opens so many windows of thought and uncharted territories, and produced catalogs, produced exhibition, shown the work. That was incredible, and I think we still see the echoes there. Again, I think in terms of US, America, it's interesting, of course, from California. I mean, you have a bigger Mexican presence. You have a bigger Central America community. If you go to Miami, you have a more historical Cuban presence, but also now recently Venezuelan and Brazilian. If you're here in New York, we have a depth with Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, which still hasn't been dealt with, you know. So being Latino in the state or Latinx in the States, it's I mean, it's very complex and very different. It's different in Texas, it's different in Chicago and Detroit. I mean, there's many different communities from many different backgrounds with many different generations or years being in the States. And I mean, hopefully it will be interesting also to see if there's patrons coming out from these communities. No, I think that would be an interesting way also of finding support for this to happen. In our terms, as I said, I mean, we're very lucky that we've been able to build this group, to have the support of about 24 patrons who are helping us do this work. We wouldn't be able to do it without them. People always think museums are rich, you know, and they have money. I go to Latin America and they're like, yeah, you're going around with money, buying. I'm like, no, like everything we want, we need to raise. You know, it's a U.S. model. But I mean, that's why you go to museums in Latin America, and many are not collecting what the artists are producing now. So.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think what's important of what we're doing is also incorporating patrons who are not from Latin America in this kind of making the mission grow. And something that I always tell my patrons is, yes, it's great that we do this here. It's great that we bring art into the Guggenheim Museum in New York. It's great that we're showing or acquiring this work of artists. But let's think also how we can do things back in the region. No? How can we support weak museums there? How can we support artists there? How can we support smaller initiatives there? How, I mean, with very little, we can also make change back in the region. No? So I think that's part of our double mission, and it has to do with that question that you said, how do you deal with that?
Right, two audiences.
I think it's also very important to mention Patricia Cisneros, Estrellita Brodsky. You know, they are very important donors, patrons, supporters, collectors. They are more or less our DNA or ADN or whatever. And but if you see the donations, till today, probably the biggest donation has been made by a Latin artist to a Latin museum, which is Fernando Botero, donate $400 million in art. That's very good, but it's not really correct. That we need to do ourselves these things alone. I see talking about the Getty And some museums, they receive a check for $450 million donations, just to recreate what they already recreated. I think it's time to change a little bit the order of the donations to integrate what is already there.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'll keep it really short, but I think the patronage aspect that you bring up is really important, because that is something I've talked with a lot of younger dealers with, is that they really want to be included in a larger conversation beyond just being a Latin American gallery, because they want to reach a broader patronage base at this point, and they know that there's people out there interested in it. And when you think about something like the Cisneros has done for our already understanding of Latin American art today, like, I really think that that's a case for kind of breaking down the walls of this terminology to kind of really get other people on side with supporting these artists. And like you said, bringing it back to actual Latin American countries themselves and the production that's going on there right now.
Yeah, I think it's good also to look at some other examples. For example, I was thinking now, when we talked about the Getty and supporting research, what Mari Carmen Ramirez has done in Houston through the Institute of Studies for Latin American Research. I mean, a research-based initiative. I see Ariel Asquez here, and through ISLA, he's also supporting Latin American research in New York. So really not underestimate the value of research, because I think that's part of the job also, that at the end benefits all.
Yeah, it's true.
We had a question in the front here.
I have a question for you. The proliferation of the art fair model. So, for example, Arco and Maco and Arbo and all these things, that's also created an interest and a broadening a little bit the base of where you can see art. If it's not in the museums, then how do you see the responsibility now of gallerists to really uncover and bring to light amazing works?
Well, actually, the art fairs has been very important. Because in the old times, as you know, people, they travel all over around the world just to see galleries. They go a full trip to Italy just to see galleries in Milan and Rome or whatever. But now, obviously, you can put together different continents, different cultures, different galleries, from the contemporary to the modernist, in one place. Has been very important, But also it's important that the big art fairs include more, no sections. They need to mix more, as you see here in TEFAF, which is one of the most unbelievable art fairs in these terms. Is probably the #1 in the world, because you don't see any mix. You just see quality here. And the people, they just appreciate that. Today, I think, regarding, obviously, for the small galleries, it's not our case, but obviously we suffered that in the beginning. The prices we pay exactly like they pay for an exhibition of Murakami or an exhibition of Christopher Wall. We have the same expenses as everyone, As I told you, every day we increase the desire of Latin American art, and probably we will get one day to these prices. I don't know when, but they're very important, these Latin fairs.
If I could actually follow up on that, I was just thinking back on the Art Basel report from this year, included a figure saying that of Latin American gallerists, 67% are optimistic about 2019, thinking that their sales are going to increase in the next year, compared to only a quarter of US and European galleries. And yet, in the news, there's been a lot of coverage of what's happening in Venezuela, what's happening in Brazil. Why do you think that is? Why are Latin American gallerists optimistic despite some of the...
Because we have so many good artists for so low prices, just like that. It's a question of market. You buy a mediocre Gorky for $5 million, and for $5 million you buy probably 5 extraordinary Matas. And who is better than another one? That's not my answer, or my question is, one was almost the teacher of the other one, Motherwell, or you see Louise Nevelson, she was inspired by Edgar Negret, but the Negret cost $20,000 and Louise Nevelson $230,000. It's a question of market, and obviously people, collectors, donors, they start to see, okay, listen, here's really quality to be support and to be collectible, and that's why we have great expectations.
And also what you're saying about the art fair, in a way, it's this platform where you can see for the same amount of money, you could buy something that's canonical, historically important, or a young emerging artist that has very little exhibition history. So
Of course. You can build a collection for a very decent amount of money in Latin America, even in the modernist. Don't go even with the contemporary part. The contemporary, you can buy a really important collection for nothing, in comparison, obviously.
in comparison.
In comparison.
Going back to your question of the first, I think that the model has been very important in terms of almost each country now has a fair happening. No? There's one in Santiago, one in Buenos Aires, one in Rio, one in Sao Paulo, one in Bogota, two in Lima, two in Mexico City. So it's been really good in terms of building new generations of collectors, supporters, and publics, and people that engage in integrating artists, supporting artists, integrating them into collections. So I think that in those terms it has been really, really beneficial. I always suggest to friends that ask me, okay, where do I start in going to Latin America? I was like, just choose one fair, whichever. Go to one of the cities, go to the website, write to them, tell them that you're going. They all have visitors programs, and it's a great way into going to one scene. The next year, choose another city, go to somewhere else, compare.
Yeah.
Very quickly, we talk a lot about art fair fatigue nowadays. There's just so many all over the place, like you're saying. But I think what we take for granted, being in a place like New York or something like that, or at a fair of this magnitude, is that those smaller fairs, the quality and the prestige of them has gotten so much better. And I was just at Espiarte and Arteba a couple weeks ago, and how instrumental and important those fairs remain for artists that are working in those regions, and how far they can help them get to a place like Frieze, like TEFAF, these kinds of fairs that we're all at. So I think that it's we have to be really mindful of how we think about how those fairs are functioning. It's much different than something at this level, and they're really important to foster this new generation of artists.
And despite art fair fatigue, it is the most efficient way probably to just see an incredible amount of material all in one place at one time, see a bunch of local galleries that otherwise you would have difficulty maybe.
Yeah.
But we love this size of fairs, so
That's perfect.
well done, TEFAF.
Yeah.
Any final questions? I think we have time for maybe one more question. No?
Means that we do a great
Okay, I
job.
guess we covered everything. Thank you so much.
Good job.
Before I let you all go, I'd just like to make a final comment, sort of spurred by this conversation, of course. In the fall, I've said it before because it applies to a couple of the other programs we've presented also. I've been working with a director of the Asia Society Museum on the ideas, because it's complicated, for a panel on terminology. And again, it's so clearly important across all kinds of platforms and disciplines, and particularly bringing up, Pablo, the indigenous question and how we think about that in addition to Latinx, et cetera. So I think it's a conversation about words and how we see them, how we use them, how we've been used to using them, and where they now fail us. And we have to think very seriously then about how we think about these things for the future, because they affect things like the market, they affect the future of artists, and collectors, because if you're looking for something and you actually don't have the vocabulary for it, how can you think about it or talk about it? So please look for that in the fall. And again, just a huge thank you to all of you. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here.